everyone, and welcome back to the Legal Insight podcast by HHQ. And I honestly cannot believe that we are already at episode 36. Is it 36?
Yeah, 36 is crazy.
It has been a very meaningful journey so far. And for those who have been following us, you may also be seeing more new faces across our Legal Insight platform as HHQ continues to grow and expand our practice areas. Now, for this episode in particular, we will be focusing on something extremely important and crucial, especially in the personal data protection landscape in Malaysia. Now, just last week at the time of the recording on 30th April 2026, the Department of Personal Data Protection, or PDP, officially released 3 new guidelines. Namely, the first one, the Data Protection Impact Assessment Guideline, or DPIA Guideline. Second, the Automated Decision Making and Profiling Guideline, or the ADMP Guideline. And thirdly, the Data Protection by Design Guideline, or the DPIA Guideline.
It's
a mouthful of acronyms today, but follow along and you will be up to speed in no time. Now, gone are the days where practitioners complained that the PDPA landscape in Malaysia was outdated and even slow moving. Now, the pendulum has swung in the other direction as it stands. As it rains, it pours. And organizations are quite literally trying to catch up with the wave of regulatory changes being introduced within such a relatively short period of time. There is certainly much to digest and absorb over the next few episodes, especially for in-house counsels who must not only understand these regulatory changes, but also undertake the more important and difficult task of translating these requirements into actual internal implementation. So instead of overwhelming everyone with 3 guidelines in just one episode, we are very glad to have with us Ong Johnson, our Head of Technology Practice Group, and also Khai, the Co-Head of our Technology Practice Group at HHQ. Now, they will be helping us split this topic into a 3-part installment or 3-part series.
Trilogy.
Trilogy. Yeah, and for each installment or each part of the trilogy, we will focus on one guideline so that organizations, legal teams, and data teams can have a broad understanding of what each guideline is intended to achieve, its general scope, and how it may operate in practice. Now, for today's episode, we'll be focusing especially on the DPIA, which is the Data Protection Impact Assessment Guideline. Now, Johnson and Khai, thank you for joining us today.
Good to see you, and I love your new suit.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we're all donning our new suits today.
Not me.
Not Khai, though. Yeah, so Johnson, maybe we can start right at the beginning. We have heard the term DPIA, or Data Protection Impact Assessment, being used more frequently in the personal data protection conversations. But it's also true that as lawyers, unless we specialize in this area, many of us have heard the term here and there without necessarily understanding or appreciating what it actually means. So to set the stage, perhaps you can explain a bit what DPIA is.
Yeah, definitely. Very happy to. Good to see you, Zach. So, of course, most companies, I think by now, they probably have heard of DPIA, but it's also very true that many companies or even lawyers, they may not actually fully understand the scope and also what does DPIA actually mean. So in very simple terms, DPIA is an assessment. We call it Data Processing Impact Assessment. The intention is to actually you want to assess how a specific processing activities or otherwise processing operation may actually impact personal data protection. Because as you can tell, every companies, it involves different form of processing activities, and then different activities will carry different risks. They may potentially impact personal data. The whole intention of DPIA is to really look into every specific processing activities and to understand how these processing activities may potentially impact personal data. So let me give one example. Let's say for hotel sector. For hotel sector, it's quite normal for hotels. They'll be implementing something called CRM. CRM is a tool. The intention of CRM is to manage the clients, is to actually manage booking reservations and to also manage the client portfolio, including sending some marketing materials and also making sure the rooms they book is actually being well reserved for you. The entire processing activities and also the platform, if we are looking from a DPIA perspective, we are going to look into this platform. How are they going to impact personal data? Because as you can tell, in order for me to utilize the particular CRM platform, I need to pump in my customer data. So with that, potentially, it's going to impact their personal data. Similarly, let us use education sector. For example, let's say a university, they have decided to actually deploy a new AI tool. That particular AI tool is for them to decide on admission. So for example, if I actually churn in the personal data of the students, which includes their certificates, their academic result, and also their core curriculum activities, maybe the AI tools, they are able to make recommendation, they are able to filter, they are able to reject, or even just directly admit particular students purely based on the AI tool alone.
Right.
So in DPIA context, what does it mean? It means that we're going to look into this tool and to understand how is this tool, how is this particular processing activities is going to impact personal data of the students.
Thanks, Johnson. Now that's helpful. We understand now what DPIA is.
Yep.
I think the natural follow-up question is why? Why do we need the assessment guideline? And companies are obviously not conducting DPIAs for fun. There must be a reason why this is becoming an important feature of the PDP framework. So what is the purpose of conducting this assessment?
Yeah, I love the question. Right now, we want to understand the why behind what. Of course, no one is ever going to do something for fun, right? Because ultimately, in order to actually conduct DPIA, it involves cost. So I would say that the whole purpose of DPIA is to really understand the specific personal data protection risk that is being linked or being connected towards that particular processing activities. As I mentioned earlier, every companies will have different processing activities, and every processing activities will carry different kind of risks. And when we are referring to risk, the magnitude of risk, the level of risk will also differ. Certain kind of activities may only carry very minimal risk, whereas some activities will actually carry very high level of risk. Then when it comes to different kind of risk, we have to deploy different kind of measures for us to mitigate, for us to prevent the risk, and for us to actually ensure companies they are fully compliant with all the PDP principles under PDP 2010. Of course, then with that, typically what we do is as a law firm, we will be coming out with a DPIA report. In the report, we will be highlighting what are the red flags, what are potential non-compliance issues, and then we'll be making some recommendations so that companies will be able to understand if I go to deploy these particular tools, how am I supposed to also ensure I don't infringe, I don't breach PDPA 2010.
Understand. Now, thanks, Johnson. Now, Khai, let me bring you in here. Now, Johnson has explained what DPIA is and why it matters, which is really important. Now, the next question is really about responsibility.
Yep.
Who is actually supposed to carry out these DPIA exercise? Does it mean every company right now listening to this episode has the responsibility to conduct DPIA, or is it a certain class of companies?
Yep. Just like most of the obligations under the PDPA, so it is not surprising that this particular obligation on the conduct, or rather the carry out of DPIA, also falls primarily on the data controller. So as the data controller, being the person that really determines the processing activity, how a particular processing activity should pan out, what kind of personal data do you actually need, what is the purpose, what is the flow, and how do you actually carry out the entire processing activity. Being the person that controls and determines all these things, you have the primary responsibility under the Act to make sure that, or rather to carry out the DPIA. But that doesn't mean that data processor, you play no role here in this regard. Because at the end of the day, assuming that we take Johnson's example just now of hotel using a CRM tool, assuming that the CRM is on a SaaS deployed through a SaaS model, right? So you have a service provider or a vendor sitting on the other side that is maintaining and perhaps providing support to the CRM software. So whenever you upload and input any kind of data, any personal data on the platform, to some extent, all this vendor or this service provider, they are also processing the personal data on your behalf. In order for you to assess, hey, what is the risk of this processing activity, that I will definitely, as a data controller, I definitely need to know certain metrics regarding the CRM software. So what kind of access control do they use? When do they store their data? Do you actually engage sub-processor? Because perhaps you don't own your, as a service provider, maybe you don't have your own data center. So you need to then engage another sub-processor to store all this data, right? What are the security measures in place? What is your retention settings? Do you even have audit logs? So a lot of all these criteria that are relevant in assessing the risk behind a particular processing activity, all these things may sit outside of the organizations of the data controller if you do engage data processor. And hence why, when it comes to the conduct of DPIA, while the primary responsibility rests on data controller, data processors, they have a part to play as well. Surely, I think as data processors, you can expect that data controllers will definitely come to you and ask for a lot of all this information regarding how you will be processing and how you will be managing the personal data that you will be receiving from the data controller. And you also posted a second part. There's also a second part to your question, right? Not every data controller that is listening to this podcast right now will have to carry out a DPIA. Ultimately, the guideline makes it very, very clear. There is a certain threshold that you need to meet in order to determine, or rather, in order to have that responsibility to carry out DPIA for a particular specific processing activity.
Understand. So now we know the what, the why, and the who. The next question will be when. When does a company, need to conduct this DPIA exercise?
Yep. So that flows from what I said just now. Not every single data processing activity will call for a DPIA. Ultimately, it depends on risk. There is a risk assessment to be done by data controller. So this is also set out very, very clearly under the guideline. There is a 2-tier assessment process. The first tier being a quantitative assessment, while the second tier being a qualitative assessment. So let's look at the quantitative assessment first. If, as a data controller, a particular processing activity involves processing of personal data of more than 20,000 data subjects, or if it involves the processing of sensitive personal data, including financial information data of more than 10,000 data subjects, then the quantitative threshold, or rather the quantitative assessment, is considered as having been met, which means as a data controller, you will then have to carry out a DPIA with regards to this particular specific data processing activity of yours. So perhaps some of you listening, you'll be thinking that, hey, this sounds like deja vu. You've heard this before. Yes, that is exactly the case, right? Because the quantitative assessment is the same as the assessment to be undertaken to see whether you need to appoint a DPO, a data protection officer, or not. So this is the quantitative assessment.
So is it safe to say that the moment I need to appoint a DPO, chances of me meeting the threshold to conduct DPA is actually relatively high?
It's relatively higher, but it's also different in the sense that when you are carrying out the assessment to see whether you need to appoint a DPO, that's on your overall organizational data subjects
The holistic
count.
approach.
Correct. But whereas when it comes to DPIA, you're not looking at the data subjects that you have in your entire organizations, but rather specific to each processing activity.
Right.
So if this specific activity involves only, let's say,
9,000.
9,000 data subjects, or even 10,000 data subjects without sensitive personal data, then you still don't have to carry out a DPIA, even though you meet the threshold to appoint a DPO, right? So ultimately, when it comes to DPIA, we have to understand that and be very mindful that it's specific to data processing activity.
I see. So it is a cumulative since time immemorial.
Cumulative is DPO.
Okay.
Cumulative
so this
is
is
DPO.
just specific activity.
Specific activity. Yeah.
At any point in time, you. Okay.
Correct. Correct. So then moving on to the qualitative assessment. So this is where it requires a little bit more judgment, and also for there to be risk assessment exercise to be undertaken by the organizations. The DPIA guideline makes it very clear that if your processing activity, regardless of how many data subjects you are actually interacting with, if it carries a high risk to the protection of personal data, then you will have to carry out a DPIA as well. So now you really need to exercise your own judgment and look at the processing activity that you have on hand to see what are the associated risks, and whether this risk, can you categorize them as low, or is it medium, or is it high? But of course, when it comes to assessing what is the level of risk, the guideline is also trying to be helpful. The guideline is trying to be helpful. The DPIA guideline is actually trying to be helpful to help data controllers to assess what kind of data processing activities would generally or commonly be considered as having high risk to the protection of personal data. It actually sets out a non-exhaustive factors, right? For example, if a processing activity may produce legal effects or significant effects on data subject, where it involves systematic monitoring, It uses innovative technologies, involves tracking location or behavior. It targets children or vulnerable individuals, or whether it involves automated decision making and profiling that may pose high risk to data subjects. These are the examples given in the guideline where if you are doing any of these things, or rather where your data processing activities involves any of these things, then chances are your processing activity will be considered as having a high risk to protection of personal data in Malaysia.
Sure.
For example, if you are wearing an Apple Watch, right, or one of those Whoop band or fitness tracking ring, where it actually monitors your vitals, your heart rate, your oxygen intake, and also to track your sleep patterns. So all these things involve systematic monitoring of data subjects, right? So things like that typically would be considered as high risk. Or if you are deploying an AI to help you to assess the eligibility of loan applicants, if you are a bank, for example, because things are being done automated through automated decision making technology. So normally there may be high risk to the data subjects in the sense that their access to loan may actually be prohibited or rather may actually be impeded. So scenarios like that, examples like that would be where there may be high risk to the protection of personal data, which then may trigger the conduct of a DPIA by data controllers.
Understand. Now, Johnson, after understanding when a company should conduct DPIA, perhaps the most important practical question is how?
How?
Yeah, how to actually conduct one, right? Of course, without turning it into a deep technicality that may bore our listeners. But maybe you can just lay down the principles or the practical steps of conducting an assessment.
Yes, Zach. Wonderful question. After knowing the what, the why, the when, right now it's for us to actually understand how are we supposed to actually conduct DPIA. So the DPIA guideline has been very helpful. They actually provided 5 key, we call it the key steps or key elements for companies to actually conduct DPIA. The approach, they call it DEICA, DEICA. Let us start with the first two. The D and E. D, it means describe. Whenever you want to look into any processing activities, it's important for you to actually be able to understand the purpose and the whole intention of the processing activities. You must be able to describe. You need to understand what are the personal data being involved, the data flow, and also the main purpose of processing. Why are you processing the personal data? There must be a fundamental reason. You don't process personal data purely for fun. And then after understanding the D, we move on to the E. E, it means that evaluate. So when you want to evaluate, you want to evaluate the compliance, the necessity, and most importantly, the proportionality of processing activities in relation to the purpose. So a lot of companies that we have seen, you just want to process personal data for one small purpose, and yet they overkill it by asking for tons of information that is totally not relevant. I'm sure that a lot of people will be able to relate. It's like, why are you asking me this information? It's not even relevant to the purpose of you processing
Providing this service.
Yes,
well.
correct. So exactly. So right now we have to evaluate whether are you collecting unnecessary information just to process for this small purpose. Moving forward will be I. So the I, it means that you have to identify what are the risks involved. Because as I mentioned, every single processing activities, you will be carrying different kind of risks, different kind of impact towards personal data of data subject. You want to actually identify, you want to analyze, as mentioned by Khai earlier, different kind of risks. We can also categorize in 2 parts as well. Number 1 is actually what is the risk, the level, the magnitude of risk. Is it high risk, medium, or low? And then after that, we have to understand the likelihood. How likely or what is the possibility or probability of the particular risk happening as well. So after I is to consider. Because right now you have a clear picture, you know why are you processing it, you know what are the personal data you are collecting it, you also know what are the potential impact. So right now you want to actually consider the measures, consider the steps for you to actually address those risks. So you want to actually say that, for example, maybe I need to implement certain steps. I need to actually implement certain protocols in order for me to further safeguard the whole personal data protection framework for your company. So the last step, after implementing, you want to assess. You want to reassess to see that whether whatever that I recommended, whatever steps that I'm going to implement, is it even helpful? Because if it's not helpful, then in the case, whatever that you're doing is actually not beneficial. So that is why the last step will be to assess. So I would say that the whole DPIA is actually both a legal and also practical perspective. From a legal side, you want to see how is a company going to comply with PDP. And from a practical perspective is you want to also understand after knowing the risks, what are the potential steps? What are the preventive measures a company can actually deploy? The resources that companies should allocate to also protect the personal data of data subjects. So it's actually a very practical and also legal approach, seeing the whole DPIA.
Thanks, Johnson. Now, that's pretty clear, the DICA approach, right? Now, after the DPIA has been conducted, so I'm assuming there's an output of it, and it probably comes in the form of a report.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's a template out there for that report, but I trust that's usually a report.
Yes.
Right? Now, what should an organization do after producing this DPIA report, and what should this DPIA report even cover? Do you already know?
Yes, of course. I mean, you're spot on. I mean, how can lawyers or how can companies survive without a report, right?
Yeah.
Of course, after you completed everything, you need to produce a report. We call it DPIA report. Typically, as I mentioned earlier, you will be engaging a law firm. So the law firm will be supporting the data team, the legal team, and also the DPO to understand the entire end-to-end data processing activities. And then with that, we will be coming up with a report. I would say that the report, the most important part, we want to actually clearly highlight all of the risks, the gaps, and the potential non-compliance issues under PDPA in relation to these activities. So after knowing all the risks, what you need to do is the law firm or the lawyer should also always make practical recommendation. The recommendation telling them how are they supposed to actually mitigate and how are they supposed to prevent those risks from happening. As we know, when it comes to risk, it's never about we want to fully remove, we want to eliminate those risks. It's about how are we supposed to use practical measure to reduce the likelihood of those risks from happening. Then with that, the management will be reading the report. The management should consider whether whatever recommendation, does it actually make sense? And then the company, the senior management should allocate the resources, should actually make sure they assign the right people to implement these steps into the company.
So this is not actually just a box ticking exercise. Where
No.
you come with the report and then it just sits there in case someone comes to check.
Yeah, so it's very important that after we produce a report, fundamentally, the company, after review the report, after understand the report, they have to do something. Otherwise, the report is just as good as just paper tiger. So you want actual implementation, actual execution.
Sure. Thanks, Johnson. Now, Khai, let me turn to the validity of the DPIA report. I mean, is there a deadline to do this thing? And once a company has actually completed the DPIA, how long does this report last? And is it just a one-off thing? Or do you have to review it from time to time when your risk changes? Or should companies refresh it from time to time?
Yep. So I suppose this is the part where lawyer likes it the most, right? You're not just engaged for just one time, because the answer is there is a validity period, or rather there is an expiry date to every DPIA, to every report. The guideline again makes it very, very clear. Once you have done a report, you have done a DPIA assessment, and you have prepared a report setting out the elements that Johnson has mentioned just now, that report is only good for 2 years, no more than 2 years. So it requires organization, it forces data controllers to refresh the entire exercise, the whole DPIA, every 2 years. And why? The reason is because technology changes, business processing activity changes, the type of technology and the type of processes that you are carrying out internally, your protocols and everything may have changed from time to time, right? So 2 years is the mark that the DPIA, or rather the PDPC, has set for a DPIA report to be valid. So this is also, of course, I think companies should also be mindful that there may be changes to a particular processing activity, how they would process the personal data, and also the type of personal data that they may need for every single data processing activity. So if you have done a DPIA and you have decided from the findings of the report to proceed and to go ahead with particular data processing activities, but subsequently half a year later, you decided to maybe expand the scope of processing, or rather to add on more data points to be collected from data subjects. You want to do maybe behavioral tracking now. So that's why you need to collect more data from the data subjects, right? So things like that, where it involves material changes to a particular, or rather to an existing data processing activities, which was covered by a DPIA report. That will trigger an obligation on the part of the data controllers to actually go back to the report and redo and look at the assessment again, just to make sure that the risk and the mitigation measures that I have suggested, that I've highlighted to the board previously, would still be valid, or would they now be redundant, and I may need to relook at the risk assessment factors and also the risk mitigation measures.
That's actually a really good principle to adhere to anyway. Like whenever you are rolling out new initiatives, now you have an added layer of thinking about the risk, thinking about the data subject. I think that places a really good obligation on the companies to actually be mindful of what they're actually doing and not just roll out a bunch of stuff without.
So that ties back actually to DPBD guideline that you mentioned just now, which we will talk about in one of our later episodes.
Sure. Now, the final substantive question from me, Khai, is that for companies who are now listening to this episode and they think that they may need to conduct this DPIA exercise, but they're clueless about where to start, how to start, what would be your top 3 pointers right now for them to get starting?
I suppose just like any audit, just like any gap analysis exercise, you first need to understand what are the activities that you are carrying out at the moment. So perhaps I'll just give a quick 3 pointers. So the first step is always to look at your existing data processing activities, do a stock take, do a quote-unquote due diligence, so to speak, to understand every single data processing activities that you are carrying out, all your vendors, all your data touch points, all the technologies that you are using, who are the processes that you are engaging with, and how do you actually collect personal data? What is the entire personal data flow? So have that prepared. Look at all these things. Again, is so that you know what are the things at this moment. Take a snapshot of your data processing activities at the moment, at this point in time. Then, once you're done with that, do a preliminary screening of all these data processing activities against the two assessment that I mentioned just now, the quantitative assessment and also the qualitative assessment, to see if any of these data processing activities actually meet the assessment threshold. So if the answer is yes, then you know that these particular sets of these specific data processing activities will require a DPIA to be done on them, right? The last pointer is it pertains to how a DPIA should be done. So it's not as simple as what Johnson has mentioned in a sense. It's not as simple as having a checklist, having a report just to write down to whatever risk that you think are relevant and what are the possible risk mitigation measures, and that's it. Because assuming lawyers' legal department is the one that is preparing the report, they may not know how data actually flow. They may not know what kind of security measures have actually been implemented by the organization. What is the specs of the firewall event? What is the entire data architecture, your IT technical infrastructure architecture within the organization? Right? So surely you need to pull in different experts within the organization, your IT team, your cybersecurity team, and sometimes not sometimes, and in most of the cases, you will definitely need the actual data users as well. Let's say your HR team or your finance team or your marketing team. You will need their input because you need them to tell you how will they exactly be using the personal data. So my last pointer is actually to make the entire DPIA exercise a cross-functional exercise. Otherwise, it will just not work.
It's just
whatever
on paper.
Report, correct. Whatever report that is prepared by, let's say, an in-house legal counsel, will just be, Johnson used the word paper tiger. It would exactly be that. It would just be something that is irrelevant, that an organization would not be able to use at all.
It just sits on the shelves. Doesn't.
Yes.
Now, thanks, Johnson and Khai. This concludes our episode for today. And it's what a relief, because like at the start of this episode, it felt like a very technical conversation, but actually at the core of it, it was actually very practical about how organizations should look at their their risks and how to mitigate them, when processing data. Now, for our audience, this is the first episode of our 3-part discussion on the new PDPA guideline released on 30th April 2026. So hot off the press, fresh new guideline. And in the next 2 episodes, we'll be focusing on the other 2 guidelines, namely the Automated Decision Making, or ADM, and Profiling Guideline. and the Data Protection by Design Guideline. And perhaps given how quickly the PDP landscape in Malaysia is developing, this may also be a signal perhaps for Johnson & Khai to start working on the second edition of their PDPA book.
Wow.
I mean, it's already selling like hotcakes off the shelf, so I mean, time to start on the next edition, I suppose. But on a serious note, thank you again for joining us, Johnson & Khai. To everyone listening, thank you for tuning in to the Legal Insight podcast by HHQ. We hope this episode has given you a clearer and more practical understanding of the DPIA guideline, and we look forward to having you join us in the next 2 episodes.